Alright folks, welcome back to another video right here on Jason's Wrestling Channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about World Championship Wrestling, one of the all-time great wrestling promotions in the world. Now it started out as the NWA, and back then there was territories. There was the NWA, there was the WWF, there was the AWA, Jim Crockett Promotions, and another WCCW. And you were able to take your title and go wrestle at other wrestling promotions back in those days, back in the territory days. Now, Ric Flair became the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, and he went all over the world defending that title. It wasn't like to where you just had a title like in the WWE and you could only defend it there. The NWA title got defended in other promotions in other countries. So eventually, WCW was bought by Turner Broadcasting Systems back in the 90s. And they turned it into WCW. And Ric Flair pretty much made WCW what it was. And he lost the title to Sting at the Great American Bash one year, allowing Sting to win his first world title. And then later on, Flair would win it back. And then in 1993, Ric Flair's contract was coming up for renewal. And him and Sting were supposed to wrestle again. Jim Herd didn't want Sting to become the WCW champion. And Ric Flair said, no, I'm dropping the belt to Sting. He was like, put a deposit down on the belt. Jim Herd goes, no. They got into an argument. And Flair said, fine. You know, he's like, I put a deposit down on the belt. We promised Sting that he'll be the champion. So then Flair just took his belts and left. He took the big gold belts and left and went over to the WWF. And they showed the big gold belts on WWF television. And Ric Flair was walking around saying he was the real World's Heavyweight Champion. And he was in a feud with Hulk Hogan. Only thing is that feud never happened in the WWF. Would happen much later. And Flair eventually won the WWF title at the Royal Rumble one year. And then he went to WrestleMania to defend it against the Macho Man Randy Savage. It's where Randy Savage would end up beating Ric Flair for the WWF Championship. And then Flair would eventually win the WWF title back. And he lost it to Bret Hart because he was going back to WCW because his contract was pretty much coming up. And then Monday Night Raw, he lost to Curt Hennig. So then Flair went back to WCW, and Sting, at the time, was the WCW World's Heavyweight Champion. And then he lost it to Vader. And then at Starrcade 93, Ric Flair came back, and there was a match. There was a feud between Flair and Vader. Vader attacked Flair on TV one day. And Flair had to put his wrestling career on the line against Big Van Vader at Starrcade. So they went into the match. Flair ended up beating Vader. And he was the WCW champion until Hulk Hogan came to WCW in 92. Hulk Hogan came on board to WCW, and they had like a ticker tape parade for him outside of in Disney MGM studio. He was in a yellow car and stuff for his contract signing. And Ric Flair kept saying that Hogan was just a guy coming into a tough place to hang out, and that Hogan couldn't beat him. So then they did a contract signing at Bash at the Beach later on that year. And the main event was Hogan versus Flair. So at the Great American Bash, Hogan ended up beating Flair for the WCW Championship. And then Hogan would remain the WCW champion. And then Ric Flair had his rematch at Halloween Havoc later on that year. And both men put their careers up on the line. Flair ended up losing because he wanted time off, basically. He wasn't really retiring, but he wanted time off. And then Hogan got into a feud with Brutus Beefcake, one of his best friends, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. But Brutus was known as the Butcher at the time. And he had a group called the Three Faces Affair. So then Hogan and a bunch of guys from WCW wrestled the Three Faces Affair. It was Hogan, Sting, and I think Randy Savage. And they went up against the Three Faces Affair. Starrcade that one year. Hogan ended up beating Brutus. And then Ric Flair eventually came back. He was reinstated. He wanted to be reinstated to come back. And then Hogan eventually, in 1996, he would start a group. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash came over. Nobody knew why. Razor Ramon was walking around the audience. And they started the NWO. And they didn't know who the third man was until Fall Brawl that year. Hogan came down to the ring pretending to be on Team WCW side. And he tore off his shirt and dropped the big leg on Randy Savage and ended up pinning Randy Savage. And then Hogan did this big speech about how he made wrestling. The fans hated it. They started throwing stuff at him because he wanted to be booed. He was turning into a bad guy. And they pretty much accomplished what they wanted to. And the NWO was a big thing. They had Team WCW versus Team NWO. And it was big in the beginning. Everyone loved the New World Order. But then every segment became NWO. Like, they'd have NWO matches through every single segment of the show. They eventually took over Nitro and made it NWO Nitro for one night. They had their own pay-per-view called NWO One Night Stand, where it was all NWO matches. And eventually fans got tired of it. And Tony Schiavone said something and said, a guy named Mick Foley is going to win their world title. That should put a lot of butts in the seat. So then people switched the channel that night and went over to see the title change over on the other show. So WCW lost ratings because of that comment by Tony Schiavone. And then they started to go into a downcline. And then they brought in Vince Russo. Vince Russo was a storyline writer, and he was horrible at writing storylines. And so WCW's ratings started to get really bad. And eventually it got to a point where WCW, the Turner Broadcasting really didn't want it anymore. A lot of people that worked there wanted to pull the plug on it, but the only one that wanted to keep it was Ted Turner. And then eventually the WWF bought it, and Vince McMahon bought it because it was up for auction because Turner Broadcasting wanted to get rid of it. And that was the end of WCW. And the last match on it was Scott Steiner against Booker T for the WCW title. And if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. And if you like karaoke, subscribe to Flash Gordon Karaoke Channel 7000. You have a good day. Thanks for watching.